Recording is starting, yeah?
I have
okay. Excellent. So I'll do a quick intro, then we'll go straight to you, Hans. So welcome to the CEFACT Global Trust Registry project, one of our bi-weekly meetings. Quick reminder for everybody either watching the video or in the call, we have a code of conduct and we have IPR and other sort of rules that CEFACT provide, which are basically open source standards, royalty-free use of content. And we have an agenda today with a bunch of things in it, but what I'd like to do is hand over immediately, because Hans was offering this before we started the recording, to Hans to share his screen. I wasn't sharing my screen then, was I? I was talking without sharing my screen. That's so many times. Anyway, Hans, you can share your screen.
Hang on, yeah, it's a bit of a challenge here because it asks me to share a window or screen. I think I'll choose a window, and here we go. Share this window. Okay. So you see a street corner in the Senegal, somewhere in whatever. And this is part of global trade. People do trade on the sides of the streets.
Yep.
It's more local trade. But can you see this little sign here, Boulangerie Serine Babacar? This is more or less a business made discoverable. It's like an identifier for a business. And if you click this, you'll be taken to information about this business. So you can resolve data. This is a bakery, and the owner of the bakery may not even know that the information is presented here. Often you see things like suggest and edit, or how else do they call it? Claim this space. So what Google does is more or less giving identifiers or discoverability to businesses, to local businesses. And this is very related to what we're doing. We're trying to make businesses discoverable, or their official registry entries discoverable worldwide, aren't we?
Yes, we are. Yes, we are. And there's lots of interesting, I guess, lessons to learn from Google. Always, always in many directions, right? So the Google Maps and Google Business sort of systems have been around obviously for quite a long time, more than a decade. And the early days had lots of challenges for them because the wrong people were entering the wrong things about the wrong businesses. You know, they were just making stuff up or making things up about their opponents or whatever else. There's lots of mess. So what Google realized, and what they have to do but don't want to do, is the whole kind of governance process around, well, hang on, are you actually the legitimate owner of that business to make that comment, to add that thing? So it becomes, they're a platform. They don't want to do that. I'm just a platform.
They don't care.
Yeah.
Yes, they don't care. They create an infrastructure without looking at the legal frameworks and the governance frameworks. They just provide it, and once people realize its utility, then the legal layer is kind of coming after them, or is behind. So they're creating facts.
So well, they're creating information, certainly, and I think so. What I personally what I'm personally holding to be true is that things like Google Maps and many other layers of knowledge and data and services about businesses and about locations and about services will be provided. And when I say layers, I mean, like, there's perspectives, if you like. There's a Google perspective, there's an Equifax perspective, there's a GS1 perspective, there's a Life perspective. You know, these are all valid perspectives with a particular purpose and utility and so on. And I'm kind of very much against the idea of a kind of one ring to rule them all kind of model. So that's why for us, that what you were showing there is really very interesting, but it's not but, I mean, it's an and, right? It has a very much a utility for, say, people wandering around with their phone, a Google Pixel phone, preferably using Google Maps and finding out what the businesses are and using the business registry data that Google's managed or curated or whatever and so on. So it's sort of a consumer proposition. It's unlikely that a business is walking around.
That's the presentation layer. That's the presentation layer that you are using when you walk around in a city and you're looking for a cappuccino or you're looking for a pizza.
Yeah.
So that's just one presentation layer. You can use, or you can imagine other presentation layers that are not even human centric.
For me, the thing that, in a sense, that Alina, if she were on the call, would remind us vociferously about is that legal layer, if you like. And the reason she does that is that there is nothing that Google will stand by with the entries in that system. They will not guarantee that anything is true because that would admit liability for the entry. So they don't want to do that. So they don't do much governance about it. So it's a Wild West. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. There was a very interesting chapter or two in that book, Shoshana Zuboff's book about Who Can You Trust, that talks about the evidence and practice of trust, even in places like the dark web, where there are no rules and there are no laws, yet somehow or other, actors need to decide whether they trust each other for that. I mean, it's usually illegal trade, right? But you're still buying something from a supplier, and the supplier wants your money, and you want the supply, and you want the goods to meet a certain quality. So there's a trust network, right? Even though there's no law, there's a need to establish a trust thing. So even Google Maps with Google Businesses can establish a trust, some degree of trustworthiness, some degree of trust sort of fabric that they provide. But it's not the same as the legal trade kind of stuff. So we are narrowly looking at legal trade, authoritative sources from nation states, because it's the UN we're dealing with, and the UN deals with nation states. That's its sort of currency. What I think will happen, I hope will happen, is that what we produce could be usefully used by companies like Google and others to build their products, that build their maps or check their maps or wash against the directory of data and provide a better service. But we are not going to kind of compete with that service, because that's beyond our ambition, really. And it would actually cause us lots of problems, I think, if we tried.
That's not what I was trying to propose, that we would be competing with Google. It's just,
you're a sensible person, Matt. You wouldn't propose that, I know.
No. It's just to indicate what there already is. But anyway, let's forget about this and just start the meeting.
Well, we kind of have. So that was a good discussion. Thank you. And we have been recording. So we'll quickly go to I will remember to share my screen now. So agenda for today and effectively tomorrow is this agenda. That's the one I'll bring it up again. The agenda for today and tomorrow is this one. There's an option presented to me about stop sharing your screen or show my screen anyway, and I pressed the wrong side. So we've done the quick introductions and conduct an IPR. A previous meeting recap. This is sort of amusing for me. If you've attended both of these meetings, I know that people like Sankashan do, and a few others, Joe has. Hans, you may have, I'm not sure. But it's the same meeting, right, on 2 days. But it has a different audience and therefore a very different feel and a very different content. So these are the two summaries generated by, here comes Virginia. Excellent. Welcome, Virginia, if you're here. Hey, Virginia, can you hear us?
Yes.
Great to have you join us. We're sort of mid-flow, so apologies for not giving you the introduction and some other things. But Virginia has been a fantastic contributor to the UNTP spec and is, I think, famous in many ways in the sort of whole UN CEFACT sort of community. So thank you for joining us, Virginia. So what we're doing at the moment is just a quick recap on the two meetings we had 2 weeks ago, and I was just telling the audience that the meetings are timed for this time of day is theoretically good for Europe for 9 a.m. Madrid time. So my co-lead Aline is usually on the meeting with us. And then the next meeting is theoretically good for San Francisco, the west coast of the US and Canada. And the meeting is the same schedule, the same content, but as I was saying, the actual discussions are very different because different people join the meeting. So this is the two summaries, the two transcripts. So last meeting, Joe was helping us understand a bit more about the kind of challenges and opportunities that face us when we look at operationalization, governance of something like a global registrar information directory. So this is modeled a bit on the thinking of, say, ICAO's PKD and other systems like that. So we had that walkthrough, and the discussion for both days was a little different on what people's interests were and so on. So you'll see on the second day, we ended up talking about things like financial models and incentives, and we talked a bit about the pilots, about Spain and its ambitions for pilots. So that's the summary. Those summaries are all available to all. Everybody can have a look at the meetings we previously held. The recordings, transcripts, and minutes are all publicly available. And there's a link on this slide, and these slides are in the comments, the chats, so you can have a look at the slides. We've got some actions that we were working on from the last meeting. Alina and I have been working on the sort of structure of documents. We've got 6 sort of major documents numbered 1 to 6, because we're not that creative on the numbering system. And the documents are looking at various sort of pieces of the puzzle of what we want to deliver to UN CEFACT in July of next year, or before July, because it needs to be reviewed. So we're looking at, there's a bit of a discussion around how we might rationalize a bit of the document structure. That's still ongoing. There was an email between Alina and I at the beginning of this week. We've had some comments. I was hoping Alina would give us a sort of an update today. She might just do that via email. I'm going to talk a little bit later about pilots, about the framework for pilots. Joe reminded me that we needed to give the countries interested in pilots, that's Canada, Spain, the Netherlands potentially, India, and I'm trying to get, of course, Australia on board, because I'm sitting here in Australia, so it would be right for them to go on board. So we'll talk a bit about pilots. Sankashan, you were looking at technology architecture specifics for the operations team. How's that going, mate?
Indeed. I probably will end up completing it over the weekend and not on the 31st. But in that context, I had sent an email to you, Joe, and Alina about it. And probably when you get the time, take a look at it.
Are you're politely telling us the ball is in our court and we haven't given you your feedback yet? Is that what you're saying?
I'm not blocked on the feedback. I'm just kind of like using the 3 of you as a sounding board for some of the directions. So
we have the 3 of us have something in our inboxes to have a look at that we should be giving you feedback on, yeah? Okay.
And
cool.
This initial draft on this item that is open on me, I'll put together and share it over the weekend. See how that goes.
On this last point, the 1703 action, this is sort of like an ongoing discussion. I'll answer your point since it's in flow, Virginia. So the co-lead of this project is Alina Nicagales from the Registradores of Spain. So she's the land asset registrar for Spain, and her organization, Registradores, is interested in running a pilot. So their base office headquarters is Madrid. I know from her telling me how long the drive takes that Alina lives about 1 hour and 40 minutes away from Madrid. But I can't remember exactly where she is based. But anyway, it may well be in the Barcelona area. Yeah, given that time, too short a time to get between the two. Okay. Anyway, so you can find out from Alina. Oh, that was the last one, wasn't it? The Google Docs and stuff. I'm sort of. We started this journey with a number of documents that we needed people to collaborate on. We still are looking for collaboration, of course. And we used the Google Doc structure because it gives you a very easy way to share with anybody that wishes to have a look. You can make it open to anybody. They don't need accounts and so on to view and comment and so on. But what we will need to do is to move the content into the kind of controlled space of the UN. And the space we're heading to is this thing called UNICC's GitLab environment. I'll show you a bit about that later. I actually think that by this time in 2 weeks, where the next meeting is, I will have done that and will have moved away from Google, which is a great thing and a bad thing, because it means editing those documents becomes a little bit more technical than it was before. That's not necessarily easy for everyone. So Sankashan, you've given us a quick update. Alina was working on the digital identity anchor requirements. And so when she's working on those, they tend to be the sort of legal-esque requirements for digital identity anchors. She's been particularly interested in the legal meaning of a registrar issuing a digital identity anchor to a registrant. So what does that mean? Is that does it have a UN CITRAL kind of equivalency, MLETR, whatever kind of idea around this is the same thing as the physical thing, and it has this rights and duties on the holder and all this, that sort of thinking. So she's putting those down in fairly kind of well-structured legal type forms about what that meaning is for a digital identity anchor. And what we will need to do, and is still to be done, is to look at the sort of technical spec of the digital identity anchor, how it actually works from a technology point of view, and what it would mean for a registrar to issue it and for somebody to verify it. And that's part of what Steve was looking for this team to be working on, was that sort of both the operational legal meaning of this thing, but also the technical how do you do it thing. I'll talk about what I've been doing. I've been doing a whole bunch of things on GitLab and explainers, which we'll see in a bit. Hans has been very helpful in reviewing the explainer. Thanks, Hans, and I've hopefully improved it. You can be the judge in a minute when I show it to you. And Joe and others have been contributing along the way as we've gone through. I talked about pilots. Those of you who saw the first brief for this project will remember that the project brief, the one that was agreed by UN CEFACT in sort of January, February, and then finally agreed in April, includes the provision or the idea for pilots. So those pilots are, for want of a better term, like experiments to prove or test things, ideas that we have for this program. And we are encouraged, but we need to further encourage. We're encouraged because there are several countries saying they'd like to do a pilot. We need to encourage them further because they haven't done one yet. So we've got to kind of get them over the line, if you like, about doing a pilot and what that might mean. So the next few slides were presented a few weeks ago when we first talked about pilots, but I'm kind of putting them in this pack as a reminder, and I've cleared up a few things to make it a little bit sort of simpler. So that there's sort of two main objectives I'm suggesting for all pilots. And we want to kind of explore our understanding, test it, see if it works, and demonstrate if it does work. So prove that effectively things do work the way we hope they'd work, that they deliver the value we hope, and so on. So that means that we're not expecting pilots to always work. They might actually come up with some problem that we need to solve. It's okay if they do. That's actually probably a valuable response. And on this slide, I've tried to sort of say, for two types of pilots, who would need to be involved. So we've got two kind of core objectives for this program of work. We've got one which is talking about the global registrar information directory, and you'll see an explainer about that in a minute or two. And we can have pilots about that. What would that thing look like? How would that work? We'd need, for that to be a thing we can test and explore, we'd need an authoritative registrar. We'd need, say, registradores from Spain, or ASIC from Australia, or Company House from the UK. And they would need to be sort of working with us to see how they might go through a process of application to be registered in GRID, giving them a sort of some way of logging in and doing something and editing their data and so on. So in this column here, I'm trying to sort of say what the sort of core actions might be for a GRID pilot. For a digital identity anchor pilot, we would have more participants, more actors. We would have the authoritative registrar still. We would have some sort of supply chain participants involved, so maybe a buyer and seller. And we would then have them do some form of interaction pattern of asking the supplier, say, asking for a digital identity anchor, receiving a digital identity anchor, presenting it to a buyer, the buyer verifying it, and so on. Some sort of process of interchange, testing out a DIA. And of course, on the far right-hand column, we could have the hybrid. We could do both. We could have a kind of GRID plus DIA kind of exploration, and that would be probably the best. I'm excited that the 3 or 4 countries could actually collaborate. We could get something that works across more than one registrar and so on. That would be a good result. But we do have to sort of press the pedal a bit more about getting those involved to do something. This is unnecessarily technical, but I'll dwell on it for a bit. It's the sort of sequence diagram, if you like, about what might happen with an exchange. And it was just to give some idea to those that were looking at it a few weeks ago about how they might think about their use case and the steps involved and draw it. And it uses Mermaid, if you like, that sort of stuff. It's a text-based language that lets the diagram be drawn automatically from the text. So you edit this text here, and it produces a diagram like this diagram. So cool for people who like that sort of stuff. Back to pilots. One of the rules about pilots is that they will define their own use case within the sort of boundaries we're defining. So to Joe's point to me a few weeks ago, or during this last couple of weeks, the framework is the one I'm putting in those few slides before now, the kind of key participants that we would expect, the kind of key interactions we'd expect. Which country, Virginia, are you thinking of? Which chambers of commerce of which country?
I don't know. That's why I'm asking if anyone has connections into chambers of commerce.
So we have
to know that this is an organization that's delegated by a government that issues certificates that are not infrequently falsified.
So the answer is yes. He isn't on the line at the moment, but one of the fairly regular participants runs and I can't remember the name of his organization. It's a not-for-profit that's got a lab word at the end of it, but he's based in the Netherlands and he's worked with the Dutch Chamber of Commerce, and they've developed a system of kind of digitization of the Dutch Chamber of Commerce's records that can be used by participants. So he's keen for that to sort of pull them into the pilots, and that would give us one of the chambers of commerce. We've got some embryonic conversations with the organization called ASIC here in Australia, and GS1 are pushing also for a verifiable, it's called an ABN, Australian business number. So GS1, we're kind of collaborating with them, trying to encourage the Australian government to think about verifiable ABNs. That gets us to the sort of equivalent of a Chamber of Commerce kind of organization in Australia. But you're right, it's actually the kind of crown jewels what we're after, is the business identifier, and making sure that can't be falsely presented or used. We might include other factors. Those of you who've looked at the UNTP spec know that there are other kinds of credentials that are part of the core specification, including a conformance credential, facility records, and other sorts of documentation. So it's perfectly reasonable for a pilot to consider other documents to be exchanged. But they should always be designed to think about what the benefits are that they're trying to demonstrate. So if your pilot works, that should be great, but why is it that that's great? Who is it that's going to make the life better of, or reduce the fraud for, or whatever else it is? There's got to be some sort of idea about the beneficiaries in every pilot. And they're going to have this idea around constraints and recommendations. So once we get the pilots up and running, the idea will be that they run themselves, more or less. They might kind of communicate with us and stay in sequence, but we're not going to oversee them. That's going to be up to them to kind of run and to work with us, and we'll help them report into here and so on, but they'll be running themselves. The IPR would be under the normal rules of CEFACT. So whilst there are commercial opportunities in this space, it's going to be a kind of royalty-free process for whatever is developed, and so on. So these are the kind of core constraints and recommendations. And that was about pilots. So Joe, I know you're only on voice only, but that was, I put those slides in for the sort of framework for pilots point of view. Is that where you thought it might need a head?
No, that's great, John. The only thing I would say is there are probably two types of pilots. One which is the management of the grid, as you say, and then the DIA pilots will be probably quite tightly coupled to the extensions that are happening within UNTP. But obviously the dependency is that the DIAs are in place. So therefore we need to get the registrars involved in the grid pilots, probably ideally before the UNTP ones. Does that make sense?
It does. I'm kind of, as Joe knows me very well, I'm kind of optimistic that they could be kind of decoupled. In other words, you could usefully do a DIA pilot and you can usefully do a grid pilot. Ideally, of course, there's some sequencing between these two, and there's some logic about the way they two fit together. But I think it's possible. But you're right, Joe. There's a benefit in thinking about this in a sort of system way. But this deck is available for all to comment, and we can improve those sort of framing things. I'll deliberately attract the interests of. So it's the critical minerals bodies in British Columbia that are looking at pilots, Virginia. So Nancy Morris's team, Brianna, and so on. And in India, we have the sort of the trade department in India that are very keen on participating. So I'll directly connect to them to advise them about his reminders, if you like, about the pilots.
Just one thing, John. Just one thing. I would say yes, we can decouple them. The only issue is we probably need to make them design aligned if we can. So yes, we understand that they're designed to actually sort of join up. That's the only thing.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you. So there's a bunch of work. I don't know if Steve is echoing this on the UNTP project as well, Virginia, but there's been a bunch of work to go from a number of spaces into now a GitLab environment hosted by UNICC. That is, it's a good thing. It's been quite a bit of work to get there. I can show you what that looks like. This is our UNTP, GTR kind of embryonic pages, web pages that are generated automatically from the content that's on this site. This is an introduction to the project. All of this content, as those of you that work in this space know, is a sort of a markdown document that you can edit in Markdown, and it has the usual Git kind of source control and issues and merge and all the other things, and it automatically, if you grid, I'll get there in a second, Virginia, just hold a second. What does grid mean? So it does an automatic CI/CD, a continuous integration, continuous development kind of model. It's kind of cool, but it takes a long time to get your head around, and maybe only the geeks are interested in it. But it's basically a whole bunch of Markdown documents, and what I've done is to move what we had in Google and more or less replicate it now in Markdown. So we've got these kind of requirements documents for eligibility of authoritative registrars. We've got a beginning of a document about what kind of data do we want to capture about registrars. We've got the beginning of a document about digital identity anchors and the schemas that we need to use. And so we've got the governance document and so on. So we've got these documents now. At the moment, they're very much a draft. At the moment, the master copy I still think is the Google copy, because that's where Alina and others have been working. And at some point, I'm going to have to sort of stop the Google ones being edited and do the cutover, if you like, to here, and then we'll be working in the space. It should still provide people with a reasonably easy to view content, as you can see on the screen now, like a web page. The link for this site is in the chat, if you want to click on it. So that's one thing. What's the grid? Well, we've tried to explain that. We came up, this project has a name, the Global Trust Registry Project, which is awesome and terrifying because it sounds very heroic to create a registry for trust for the world. So we struggled with that in some ways for quite a while. And what we've come up with is that the name of the project can be quite different to the name of the thing that the project is recommending be produced. So this project is called Global Trust Registry Project at the moment. We actually had an exchange with the UN CEFACT Bureau during today with Steve Capel helping me about whether we should rename the project. I've actually said no. I've asked it not to be renamed because I've kind of labeled everything with this thing and it's whatever. And we've got used to this idea that we have a project name, which we typically just call GTR, but the project is recommending things to be done, and those things have another name, and that's okay. And we could even change the letters GTR to stand for something different than Global Trust Registry if you wanted to. It's okay. But we've come up with grid. So what is grid? Well, grid is this thing, right? This is a logical model of what we call in the UN Global Registrar Information Directory, aka the grid, which, as the slide sort of elaborates, looks pretty complicated. So what we've got is the next few images are trying to sort of walk through the meaning of the image, what the parts are and why they're there and how to understand them. And along the way, we'll explain why we think there needs to be a grid. It starts from a sequence of fairly obvious statements. So supply chains are often long and complex. And in fact, often they're not even a chain; they're a kind of mesh type structure with many suppliers and many buyers, and it's not this sort of linear path that we typically draw. But nevertheless, these things are complicated, and we've deliberately chosen a simplified representation of what is known to be a complex space. And another simplification we're choosing in our diagram is that we're showing ships for every form of transport. And it could be a plane, it could be a boat, it could be a train. But I'm just showing a ship icon because having too many icons doesn't help. So the idea with this diagram, even at this point, is that these participants, this processing plant here, for example, are both a buyer of goods or products as far as the mining company is concerned, and they're a supplier of goods or products to the next person up the chain. And that's true for all of the participants except the very beginning and the very end, typically speaking. The next thing is that legal trade, and this is a point we were talking about before we sort of started the main session, is something that occurs between participants registered in nation states, so in countries. So typically speaking, if you're going to do a trade with somebody, they want to know kind of where you're from or where you're based, what the legal basis is of your existence, effectively. So what we're a sort of axiom for us, a priori point of view, is that each participant in a legal trade transaction will be registered in a nation state somewhere in the world. Registration is a thing that happens with what we're calling authoritative registrars. So these are the body that's been recognized in that nation state as responsible for registering a thing of interest, a land asset, a company, a trademark, anything else to do with supply chains that's valuable. A registrar is typically the body that recognizes those things and who they belong to. And so we're using this idea of authoritative registrars to be those bodies. For many nation states, probably all nation states, there are very often more than one registrar. They register a lot of different things, and there are often different registrars for those different things. And in some countries, as Hans was explaining to us, like say Germany, there may be many registrars of the same type of thing. So Germany might have a system where courts and local counties can kind of register companies, and there could be lots of those courts and registrars in Germany for registering companies, and they then need to work out how to assimilate that sort of process. But so again, simple diagram, we're just showing one of these sort of Greek temple icon thingies as the registrar. We're not showing many because it's too complicated. We're only showing this one registrar per state. I'm not doing the many. We're going to distinguish, and I'm trying to do it in my talk here, between registrar and register. I'm trying to be consistent. So registrar is the body that does the registration. It's the authorized body, the authority, if you like, that does the work. What they produce, the list of things they produce, we're calling the register. And that I'm trying to be consistent, and Virginia, you'll probably help me because you're very good at that sort of thing, about being consistent about the wording we're using here. We're not showing in our diagram the registers, right? There's a lot of registers underneath each of these registrars. There's lots of data and lots of things. We're not showing them in the diagram because what we've decided in this project is we are very interested in that, but it's not our business. We don't want to tell them what to put in it. We can't tell them what to put in it. It's their choice. It's their legal right to decide as a sovereign nation state what they do. So we know they exist. We're interested in what they decide to capture and how they capture it and what their identifiers are, all those things, but we don't tell them how to do it. We're going to sort of map what they have. We're using in this diagram the same pattern for every nation state. That's another simplification, right? I mean, it would vary enormously between countries as to what they actually have in terms of supply chain participants, the numbers and the types and so on, but we'll just use the same pattern. Every trade transaction involves both products, goods, documentation, and some sort of value exchange. Hans was rightly putting out on an earlier draft of this that I didn't have the idea of value exchange or in any kind of financial transaction. And of course, there's usually a financial transaction. Then Joe pointed out to me, who's a payments expert, it may not always be money. It could be some other sorts of goods in kind and other things. So I've just used value exchange here to combine those sort of ideas about finance and exchanges of other types. So the point that we are all aware of is pretty well all of this type of documentation is mostly physical. It's PDFs or it's actual paper documents and so on. And there's a whole lot of them. There's, I think, the VC for Trade project that's being run in parallel to this is looking at KDDE, and there's 30 plus of those. This is Drummond Reed, who's a good friend of ours. therefore there's a huge amount of this sort of documentation. What we have for our point of interest is some key areas that we are always going to be interested in, the who and what. So who it is that's participating in this trade exchange and what it is that they are exchanging. So this gives us this, in UNTP terms, digital product passport is one of those key kind of elements that's exchanged, a description about the product and its attributes and claims. Yes, yes, Virginia, there could be services too. And who you are, what company are you, where are you registered, and so on. So that's what we call the digital identity anchor. And there could be other things that are useful in the exchange, including things like conformity credentials and so on. Any form of documentation that's presented to, say, a buyer or a relying party recipient needs to be checked. They've got to check it for a whole bunch of reasons. They want to check that the shipment meets their regulatory requirements that they themselves need to meet, their commercial expectations, and other people might want to check this stuff too. So border control, regulators, tax officers, whatever. There's lots of checking to be done on these documents. And then we get this sort of very simple model of the supply chains. That's this sort of squiggly line going across these participants. So we're going from a mining company to a shipping company to a processing plant to some sort of assembly or fabrication plant or something, and it's going to a car assembly thing, as far as I can tell from these icons. So we could carry on this supply chain and have a recycling, and we could go kind of a circular economy kind of thinking. But for us, this is enough, because what we want to get to is this next point. How do we know that any registrar is the authority for the area that the supplier or the buyer or whoever it is participating claims to be registered in? It's entirely possible to create a world of fabricated provenance data now with AI or indeed just human labor. You could sort of make stuff up and make up several layers of stuff up about the provenance of the goods you're wanting to sell. But they could all be fake. So how does the relying party check that, in fact, that claimed registrar for Spain is, in fact, the Spanish registrar? And what is it that they produce as a registrar that I might check to see if this thing in front of me is legitimately one of their registered things, and so on? So what's the process I can use? So we don't know what the authoritative sources are, which is why we're saying we need GRID. We need a global registrar information directory. Where could you find out what the authoritative registrars are for a nation state or a country? And there isn't at the moment a good answer to that question. So the idea is to have something modeled on the kind of processes that ICAO uses for PKD, the International Commercial Aviation Organization uses for their public key directory. So this is the way your passport works when you go through smart gates and so on. What that means is it's as lightweight as possible. It's self-managed data. It's opt-in processes, so nation states decide if they want to join or not. And once they pass through the eligibility requirements, then they kind of self-manage the data that they present about themselves. So we try to minimize the overheads. What the UN body would do is lightweight but essential governance and kind of operation to keep it, keep the lights on for the system. The diagram then becomes this complete diagram that we can see here. But the really important thing about this diagram is it's a logical model, not a physical model, by which I mean it looks like it's a centralized directory, right? But it doesn't need to be. It's logically a place where you go to find something out. But that place could be distributed. It could be cached across the world in different parts. It could even be on a blockchain, although that's unlikely, but it could be. And it could even be done through a process of issuing verifiable credentials back out to the registrars that are recognized by the GRID, and they can then do it. So there's a number of different ways you might build this thing. The logical model is this logical model. Does that make sense, Hans? Is that okay? Yeah,
absolutely.
Cool. So that's like objective one of this project is build that thing, or rather, recommend to UN CEFACT that thing should exist, and then if they say yes, then that thing should be built, and that's sort of the process that we're going through right now. That's one of the two major objectives. The other is to do with the digital identity anchor that becomes possible if you've got a GRID. So it's a sort of, as Joe was suggesting, there's a bit of a sort of chicken and egg thing about what we're doing here. Okay, that's this diagram. For those of you who are interested, is managed through a thing called Draw.io. It's a drawing package. Sorry, I have two large dogs, and both of them decided to bark at the same time just now. It's chaos. It's somebody or something at the door. So that diagram is available to all of us to edit and comment. It might be the easiest thing to do is to comment on the PDF, as Hans did. So if you go to that PDF now, you'll see the latest version, and you can kind of, as Hans did, put comments on the areas of the diagram or the pages and say where you think there needs to be changes. What I want to do with it is kind of move on to the next challenges. That creating that diagram made me realize that we probably need some other explainers about things like the digital identity anchor and how it's being used and how we see that working. So that's sort of where I think I'm going to go to next on it, as well as working on this stuff in the actual sort of UNICC GitLab environment, making that sort of ready to go. That's my body of work the next couple of weeks. That was it from me. I've been talking non-stop. I'm sorry about that. I'll stop now. Does anybody have any questions or want to say something?
You were mentioning a kind of technical work stream.
Yes.
To underpin the grids and probably also underpin the DIA.
Yep.
When is that going to start?
Well,
are there any considerations already?
Yes. I mean, you provided, I think, originally some comments on the DIA spec as is included in the UNTP, right? So you will be pleased to know if I go back to say this environment. So this is the CEFACT GitLab environment. Your changes, so if I go to spec UNTP, we put your changes forward as a pull request or a merge request as it is in this environment, and they've been approved. So if you were to go now to the public facing pages, you'll see that the improved wording and some other things you're suggesting have been made on that spec. Now, in an earlier iteration of this meeting, we proposed, while Steve Capel was on the call, that UNTP remains the custodian for the DIA spec. So inside the UNTP model, if I go through this, I'm in the right place. Docs, specification. So inside here is the digital identity anchor markdown. So inside here is the spec you can see on their web on the web page form of the digital identity anchor. Right, this is the content that you reviewed, and it's been changed since you had a look at it and so on. Now, what I want to say is this project will look with pilots and with other practical ideas at the DIA spec and put back into UNTP recommendations for changes. I don't want us to be the custodian of the DIA spec because that becomes a bit confusing for implementers of UNTP, I think. So that's the way I'm thinking about doing it. So to your point, Hans, there's two ways forward for if you're interested in the DIA spec updates. One is you can join in on the UNTP side. There's a technical working group that's in fact meeting today, ironically, at the same time as this meeting, but that won't normally happen. And Joe equally is very interested in the technical sort of evolution of the DIA spec. So I'd encourage you and Joe, and Sankashan also I know has a lot of technical knowledge and interest in this space. So there's a group of people that I know in advance are interested in that sort of idea about where would we go to next with the DIA spec, how might we test it out and explore it, improve it. And I think we should, I would want to encourage that as a working group to sort of carry on with that work. Whatever we come up with, we then push back into UNTP to improve the spec. So I know, Joe, you're only on audio. You can nod. You can't nod. I can't even see you.
I can, John. Harley's running that stream for the UNTP.
Yep.
And yes, it runs. I think it actually starts at the end of this hour, so in 10 minutes' time. Although I don't think I'm going to be able to join. But Harley's now going through the issues and the pull requests that are outstanding against UNTP. not specifically the DIA, but yes, the technical definition for the DIA expectations for UNTP will be handled through that group. The challenge is, and that's why we need to make the distinction between what are we doing, what is our responsibility for the establishment of the grid and the services that the grid will provide, and how does the services for the grid and the identification of the registries or the registrars fit in with the work to actually define the DIAs and how they're used within UNTP. DIAs are, I assume, specific to UNTP at this point in time, but there's no reason why DIAs couldn't be utilized for various different other activities. So we have to be sort of segregate our responsibilities in terms of the grid functions and the management and maintenance of the grid, and then the what it means to actually underpin and support the DIA functionality that's necessary for UNTP.
Yeah, I agree, Joe, and I'm Joe knows me as the optimist, so I'm hopeful that we can actually decouple them sufficiently that the work can carry along in parallel, but with synchronization when necessary. But I kind of think there's an argument. And the reason I say that is we know in advance that the digital maturity of registrars around the world will vary. Whatever investments they've made in some digital implementations will significantly vary. They'll have gone in different paths, different standards, different things. It will just be different. And therefore, we can't expect them all to drop everything and go on to some common standard in any one step at all. And therefore, our grid is going to map what is. And what is will be different across different registrars and nation states. So I kind of want to have that map idea as this updatable, continually kept current kind of view of what exists, and the recommendation for what might exist, the DIAs and other things, to be a kind of recommendation they can adopt when they do. And when they do, if you like, the lights go green on the grid for different entries when they start adopting it. But at the moment, they're multicolored because they're doing different things. But we want to encourage them to do the same thing if we can.
And I'd agree with you, John, because we have to, as part of the grid, enable consumers to actually understand how best to use the registrar functionality and what it is that they scope and the reach associated with that technicality as it changes, as they mature over time. So that means that not everyone will be at the same level of maturity, and the interactions will be appropriate to the maturity that they can provide. If it's a web lookup, fine, it's a web lookup. If it's a credential-based solution, fine. But that also means that relying parties are going to have the ability to do multiple different things depending on what it is they're trying to do. Yeah,
exactly right, Joe. And so we were talking, Joe and I, about that this project, if it's successful, will create in due course a grid, but that will actually create an opportunity in the market for commercial offers and service offerings. I'll explain why. One example of why that might be true. If the grid accurately maps out the diversity of ways in which things are issued and verifiable and so on across the world's registrars, then you can imagine a service being offered by some sort of entrepreneurial spirited organization to say, okay, we'll offer you a verification service across all that diversity. We'll use the grid as our source of reference as to what the authoritative registrars are, but we're going to work out all that mess of different ways and different things, and we're going to do that verification for you, and we're going to offer it as a service. And you can imagine that being something
that sounds very reasonable. It's what you describe is commercialization on the right layer.
Yeah. And it's not the UN's. I fear that if the UN were to go too far up to that layer, it would actually cause all sorts of problems, and it shouldn't play there. So
that wouldn't work.
Yeah, you get resistance, and you shouldn't get into that space. So that, Virginia, you know more about this than pretty well everyone. So does that sound reasonable to you, listening to that conversation?
Yes, it sounds reasonable.
Cool.
And it's true that the UN needs to keep a distance from the commercial implementations or aspects. I'm thinking that there may also be some things to learn. I don't know if you've looked at it from the UN low code.
Yeah, we looked at low code a few weeks ago. You're right. There are some things, and there's some very interesting things to learn from low code, positives and so risks, if you like. Low code. I think one of the things we're keen to establish is a sustainable operational model. So like this is obviously going to be a not-for-profit. It's not going to have any money being generated, but it needs enough funds to come into it to sustain itself, a sort of self-sustaining model. And the ICAO PKD system, I think, is really good for that because it's a very low per year fee per country, and yet it's sufficient for them to run that system. Whereas low code has no such funding model or anything else, and it's struggling because of that. And I think whilst it's laudable and it's really valuable, it lacks a home or any home maintenance or anything. So it's a difficult thing to keep going. So we're going to recommend, I think, for the July plenary next year that there's some sort of self-sustaining model for grid that would make sense to participants.
I was thinking in particular about the system for registering locations, which I mean, in this case, it would be even more important, which would be to say you only include a registrar in the grid if a government has said this is a valid registrar.
Exactly right. You're so right. I'm smiling because you should see Alina's requirements for eligibility. They're terrifying. Yeah, there's a lot of legal requirements that she's written down about what you must have if you're going to be eligible. So much that I think we might have to sort of loosen them a bit. But the fundamental you're saying is absolutely true. You must be the legally recognized authority for a nation state in registering this thing, and that means the grid won't have, in its first instance, very useful global services like GLIFE, because that's not what they are. Now, GLIFE might be recognized in a country as the registrar for a thing, and that's okay. Then the country says, the country X says, we're using system Y supported by GLIFE, or we're using GLIFE. Well, that's okay, but GLIFE itself isn't an entry because they're not a country that has, and so on. So it's a really important requirement. But it hopefully doesn't close the gate to countries that have very immature at the moment digital capability. That we don't want to stop them from participating, because obviously we want to raise the floor for everybody, and that includes all the developing countries. So I promise on these calls to finish 10 minutes before the hour. I failed. It's 3 minutes before the hour. I'm sorry it was a bit late. Thank you for participating. Lots to do still, so I really do encourage you all to join in on the group email system and send questions, comment on the documents that are available, get active. There's nothing you can do that will cause harm. We can always undo a change to anything. It's all sort of recoverable. So please feel free to sort of join in. Slack, the group emails, and comments and documents all open. Okay, thank you very much.
Great.
See you all next.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Hans. Thanks, Jen, Virginia.